Representative Ilhan Omar marched into the hearing room fully prepared to deflect blame with familiar political talking points, completely unaware that Vice President J.D. Vance was waiting with receipts for $250 million in vanished child relief funds. This staggering $250 million was stolen from a federal program designed to feed hungry children during the pandemic, not to finance luxury real estate, international wire transfers, premium watches, or convenient excuses for the politicians who dismantled its safeguards. 65 defendants were convicted. The primary orchestrator received a 41-year prison sentence, and the American public was left staring at the wreckage of a system that was advertised as deep compassion while operating like an unattended cash register. Sitting across the table in Dirksen 628 was Omar, whose specific legislation had reshaped the rules governing the program, while Vance arrived with a single folder, bringing no stack of rehearsed talking points and no army of aides to rescue him from uncomfortable facts. Washington hearings are typically predictable theater, filled with speeches written for social media clips, manufactured outrage tailored for cable news, and soft questions deliberately designed to never threaten the witness. This specific confrontation carried a vastly different weight because the vanished money was real, the criminal convictions were real, and every single stolen dollar equated to food promised to a child that never reached their table. Omar refused to let the proceedings settle into a rhythm, immediately declaring the hearing was pure political theater, a targeted attack on a black Muslim refugee woman, and just another administration attempt to turn immigrants into convenient scapegoats. Her loyal supporters in the gallery reacted exactly as expected, applauding loudly, jumping from their seats, and temporarily transforming the legislative room into something resembling a campaign rally rather than a solemn investigation into pandemic fraud. Vance chose not to interrupt the cheering, compete with the noise, or perform theatrical outrage for the cameras, knowing perfectly well that a man holding undeniable documents does not need to wrestle with a crowd holding slogans. When the room finally quieted, he respectfully acknowledged her journey, recognizing that America had welcomed her family, delivering what would be the only measure of personal warmth she received that afternoon. Then he drew a brutal boundary, clarifying that she had not been summoned to discuss her identity, her personal biography, or her political symbolism, but to answer specific questions about a law bearing her language and her direct responsibility. The legislation in question was the Meals Act, introduced in 2020, and later folded into the massive Families First Coronavirus Response Act, an emergency relief package signed into law by President Donald Trump during the chaotic early days of the pandemic. Omar immediately sought the protection of bipartisanship, fiercely arguing that the measure enjoyed cross-party support, was implemented under a Republican administration, and was fundamentally created to prevent kids from starving while schools were locked down. That defense sounded perfectly respectable until Vance surgically separated the massive emergency package from the specific provision hidden inside its text, noting that signing a giant omnibus bill does not mean the president personally drafted every single sentence. Trump did not write Omar's language, he did not design the waiver structure, and he did not personally select which verification protocols would be gutted. A signature at the bottom of a must-pass bill absolutely could not erase the name attached to the provision, and Vance bluntly clarified that calling a bill bipartisan did not magically divide responsibility equally across Washington. He then walked the room through exactly what her legislation had changed, calmly stripping away the comforting buzzwords of flexibility, access, and emergency response that had successfully shielded the policy from scrutiny. Under the new framework, for-profit restaurants were allowed into federal child nutrition programs. Supervised group meal mandates were loosened. Established documentation rules were eliminated, and grab-and-go distribution was massively expanded without requiring any proof that an eligible child was physically present. In practical terms, a single restaurant could legally submit reimbursement claims for thousands of meals While the government possessed drastically fewer tools to verify if the food was prepared, if children received it, or if the distribution site even had the capacity described on their paperwork. Omar aggressively called the previous rules bureaucratic barriers, insisting that closed schools and terrified families required a system capable of reaching children at home rather than forcing them into crowded buildings. Vance's counter-argument sliced through this moral decoration. He stated the debate was never about whether emergency flexibility was necessary, but whether removing a protective wall without building a replacement barrier was a reckless decision. Criminals will always search for weaknesses in public programs, Omar argued. Therefore, total responsibility belonged to the thieves who exploited the system rather than the lawmakers acting during a health crisis. Vance firmly rejected that distinction, explaining the fraud did not slip through an invisible crack. No one could have anticipated it. Erupted from a framework deliberately altered to reduce verification, inspection, and documentation. Before the law changed, meal providers had to demonstrate children were present, maintain rigorous records, and operate under standards designed to prevent public money from becoming private loot. After the change, an operator could easily claim to have served 2,000 meals without producing a shred of convincing proof that 2,000 children had ever arrived, eaten, or even existed outside of fabricated records. The criminals were absolutely guilty of stealing, but pretending lawmakers had zero duty to consider the highly predictable consequences of dismantling safeguards wasn't true accountability. It was political insulation dressed as compassion. Omar stubbornly insisted the strict requirements had merely been adjusted to meet the grim realities of the pandemic lockdown. Vance countered that they had not been temporarily modified with a strict expiration date, replaced with alternative security, or paired with an aggressive fraud tracking system. They were simply erased without a meaningful sunset provision or a serious plan to restore oversight once the emergency passed, creating a system built purely on trust precisely when billions of dollars were moving at unprecedented speed. Vance then posed the vital question that should have been answered before the legislation was introduced, not years later after raids, convictions, and missing money made the risk undeniable. Had Omar's staff conducted a fraud assessment, requested a risk analysis, or received any warning that eliminating verification standards would invite organized abuse by syndicates capable of faking paperwork for non-existent meals? Omar retreated back to the pandemic, saying desperate families needed immediate help and Congress didn't have the luxury of months of review, effectively confirming that safeguards were removed first and consequences considered later. Vance refused to let the word emergency function as a permanent pardon for terrible legislative design, noting that urgency can explain speed without excusing total blindness. The purpose of oversight isn't to prevent the government from acting, but to stop those controlling the Treasury from pretending that good intentions make stolen funds any less stolen. He reminded Omar that 65 individuals connected to the scheme were convicted, and the stolen $250 million was explicitly allocated for children whose families were struggling through unemployment and economic panic. Every fabricated invoice represented meals existing only on spreadsheets. Every bogus site report turned real poverty into a billing opportunity, and every gutted standard made the massive theft exponentially easier to repeat on an industrial scale. Reaching into his folder, Vance introduced the first piece of evidence connecting Omar's public advocacy directly to a location prosecutors later pinpointed near the center of the fraud network. The monitor displayed a 2020 video filmed at Safari Restaurant in Minneapolis, showing Omar inside the busy kitchen packing food containers, loading meals into cars, and actively promoting the operation to the local Somali community. In the footage, she confidently declared that Safari served approximately 2,300 meals every single day to local families, a staggering figure presented with the assurance of a leader, inviting the public to trust their own eyes. Vance deliberately paused on that massive number, noting federal prosecutors later identified Safari as the absolute largest sponsor site within the Feeding Our Future network ultimately convicting co-owner Salim, said of participating in a massive $16 million fraud. Investigators proved that only a minuscule fraction of those claimed meals had ever been served, meaning the heartwarming PR spectacle of loaded cars and community assistance completely masked reimbursement claims that instantly crumbled under federal examination. Omar fired back that she simply visited a distribution site to encourage access during a terrifying crisis and had never claimed to be conducting a financial audit, a response that was technically accurate but strategically evasive. Vance agreed lawmakers aren't accountants assigned to inspect every receipt before a community event, but pointed out she had actively leveraged the credibility of her office, her face, and her voice to personally guarantee to constituents that Safari was feeding thousands of children daily, all while the operators were submitting heavily fraudulent claims. The issue wasn't whether she audited their books, but whether anyone on her staff had verified that massive number before she broadcast it to a vulnerable community that deeply trusted her judgment. Omar quietly admitted she had trusted the program's operators, a confession losing its nobility considering those same operators were now convicted felons responsible for millions in vanished funds. Trust might explain walking into a kitchen, but it couldn't transform reckless promotion into responsible oversight, nor could it restore the meals that existed on federal claims, but never reached hungry children. Vance repeated the brutal consequences in language that Washington's spin doctors couldn't sanitize, explaining every fake meal represented a real child, denied the benefit Congress claimed to protect. Money meant for desperate Minneapolis families was converted into criminal profit, while politicians endlessly repeated their only goal was feeding children, as if stating a noble purpose automatically erased catastrophic results. Omar repeated her core defense, insisting she would never apologize for championing hungry children, but her constant repetition was beginning to expose the severe weakness of her answer, rather than proving its moral strength. Nobody had demanded an apology for feeding kids. The core issue was whether the broken system she helped engineer actually fed them or merely generated massive invoices bearing their name. Sensing the room grasping this crucial distinction, Vance turned a page and introduced a name that pushed the hearing beyond simple negligence and into territory Omar would find incredibly difficult to dismiss. Amy Bach was not a conservative commentator or an anonymous tipster. She was the actual founder and executive director of Feeding Our Future, convicted in March 2025 on federal charges involving sweeping conspiracy, bribery, and wire fraud, and sentenced to 41 years in prison. From behind bars, Bach was asked directly if Ilhan Omar knew about the massive grift, and her answer was chillingly blunt. She struggled to believe Omar wouldn't have known. Omar instantly dismissed her as a convicted scam artist trying to shift the blame, a highly effective response because a fraudster's accusation isn't automatically true just because it is politically useful. Vance smoothly agreed to set Bach's speculative opinion completely aside, explaining her personal opinion was not why he raised her name. During Bach's federal trial, DOJ prosecutors entered mountains of emails, text messages, and private communications from people operating the fraud network, and Omar's exact name surfaced in that hard evidence 6 different times. Vance emphasized these weren't tabloid rumors, campaign, gossip, or routine constituent letters, but specific communications meticulously selected by federal agents in a case involving $250 million. Omar passionately argued her name appears in thousands of emails every year simply because she is a high-profile congresswoman, and appearing in someone else's inbox proved absolutely nothing. Vance clarified he wasn't claiming a name alone established criminal guilt, but he pointedly asked how many of those thousands of ordinary emails had been formally admitted as evidence in a major federal fraud trial. One specific email explicitly referenced receiving direct assistance from Omar's Congressional office regarding USDA waiver, requests the exact waivers allowing the fraudulent sites to operate with gutted oversight. Omar immediately branded this as standard constituent service, but Vance noted ordinary service looks drastically different when it directly helps operators later convicted of exploiting the exact oversight barriers her office pressured the government to remove. Omar then confidently declared on the record that her office had zero operational involvement with the organization, had not managed the program, had not overseen sites, and had absolutely not directed funds. Vance didn't bother debating her wording. He simply produced a document clearly bearing the official letterhead of her congressional office. The email, dated the 14th of November 2020, was sent directly to the USDA Regional Administrator for the Midwest, forcefully demanding expedited approval for 3 expansion sites in Hennepin County. It actively pressured the USDA to waive standard site inspections, citing the pandemic and the needs of the Somali community, and was personally signed by Omar's own chief of staff. This devastating contradiction no longer relied on a convict's credibility or a reporter's interpretation because it was permanently written on Omar's official stationery. 2 of the 3 exact locations heavily championed in that request eventually appeared on the federal indictment list. Their operators were thrown in prison, and the combined fraud tied to those locations exceeded $9 million. Seconds earlier, Omar had used the absolute word none to describe her office's involvement, acting as if a forceful denial could vaporize any document waiting inside Vance's folder. Now, the room was staring at an official request from her top staffer, asking the federal government to bypass security inspections for the exact addresses that became federal crime scenes. Backed into a corner, Omar replied her staff handled thousands of complex constituent matters daily, and she couldn't personally review every outgoing email, instantly downgrading her defense from having no involvement to having no personal knowledge. Vance didn't even need to dramatize her sudden retreat, because the hard document had already proven the absolute boundary she tried to draw instantly collapsed when her own records were introduced. The press section erupted in typing, recognizing her sworn denial had just violently crashed into documentary evidence seconds after she delivered it. Vance then pivoted from the damning waivers to her public posture, asking exactly why Omar's legendary eagerness to speak mysteriously disappeared whenever investigators demanded testimony, documents, or straight answers regarding the stolen millions. During the State of the Union, she had famously stood up, screamed accusations at the president, and ensured the nation heard her voice, proving her silence was never caused by fear or polite protocol. Yet, when the Minnesota House Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee formally invited her to testify regarding the massive fortunes stolen directly from the children in her district, she completely ghosted them, blew past a mandatory document deadline, and happily benefited when Democratic colleagues successfully blocked a subpoena demanding her communications with the convicted scammers. She had also notoriously ignored a reporter in the hallway asking about the case, prompting Vance to ask why every investigative venue magically became illegitimate the moment the inquiries focused on specific waivers, specific prison sentences, and specific missing cash. Omar recited a polished response, insisting she cooperated with every legitimate inquiry, but absolutely refused to participate in politically motivated witch hunts explicitly designed to weaponize her identity against her community, a line that sounded great in a press release but functioned horribly as an actual answer. Suddenly, Senator Richardson, the ranking Democratic official who had remained stone silent through the first hour, reached for his microphone and ruthlessly stripped away her last political shield. He lightly criticized the partisan framing, but quickly pivoted to state the undeniable facts: $250 million taxpayer dollars had completely vanished from a program explicitly designed to feed starving kids, 65 criminals were sitting in jail, and the public absolutely deserved straight answers. Richardson didn't explicitly accuse her of criminal behavior, but he stared a hole right through her as he firmly stated that explanations could no longer be filtered through highly paid lawyers, PR spokespeople, and carefully crafted press releases. This stunning moment inflicted vastly more damage than any conservative attack, because the senior Democrat fully expected to defend her had instead publicly ordered her, on live television, to stop hiding and answer the questions. The other Democrats shifted nervously, grabbed their water glasses, and refused to utter a word to help her, while Omar's panicked chief of staff frantically scrolled his phone searching for a lifeline that couldn't undo the damage. Sensing total victory, Vance patiently waited a moment before introducing one final, devastating number to the record. He noted that Omar's official 2024 financial disclosure publicly listed her household assets between $6 million and $30 million. Yet a quietly amended document filed the very next March drastically slashed that valuation down to a meager range between $18,000 and $95,000. The staggering difference amounted to roughly $29,900,000, a massive discrepancy. Her office casually brushed off as a simple accounting error, supposedly caused by failing to properly calculate complex liabilities and personal debts. Vance purposely chose not to explicitly accuse her of a federal financial crime. He simply read the massive dollar amount out loud and let it hang in the air, placing it right alongside the gutted waivers, prison sentences, promoted scam restaurant, trial evidence, and her absolute refusal to testify under oath. He closed his folder, intertwined his fingers, and prepared to condense the grueling afternoon into 3 inescapable questions she couldn't possibly dodge by retreating into her biography or chanting slogan. Vance delivered his summary with chilling calmness, compressing 90 minutes of hard documents, shattered denials, signed waivers, criminal convictions, mysteriously amended wealth forms, and ignored subpoenas into a timeline so suffocatingly tight that every excuse she offered began to look thinner than the sheet of paper resting on his desk. He reminded the room she authored the exact legislation gutting security features, enthusiastically promoted the restaurant later, crowned the biggest fraud hub, appeared 6 times in internal communications seized as federal evidence, and quietly altered her personal wealth disclosure by nearly $30 million. Furthermore, for 6 solid months, she actively stonewalled state auditors, legislative panels, and local reporters desperately trying to find out who helped steal money from the poorest children in her district. Omar frantically tried to interrupt, shouting his summary was a malicious distortion. But Vance steamrolled right through her objections, fully aware the objective was no longer to convince her these undeniable records existed, but to force her to finally pick exactly which piece of the disaster she was willing to explain on camera. He held up 3 fingers and presented 3 highly specific questions, generously offering her the opportunity to answer whichever one she preferred. Question 1 was devastatingly straightforward. If she genuinely had zero knowledge of the massive scam, why had she fiercely refused to testify in front of the state committee, where she could have easily delivered her innocent defense under oath and cemented her exoneration into the public record? Question 2 zeroed in on the blocked evidence. Why had Democratic colleagues aggressively shielded her by killing a subpoena, demanding her private emails with the convicted felons? Pointing out a truly innocent official should logically be begging to release every email to definitively prove their version of events? The final question targeted the bizarre financial paperwork. Exactly how does nearly $30 million simply evaporate from an amended disclosure form just months after media scrutiny reached a boiling point? Vance casually noted innocent individuals don't typically need to erase $30 million from government paperwork, mocked the idea it was a simple arithmetic glitch, and then completely stopped talking, giving Omar the floor to decide which trap presented the lowest chance of survival. She chose to answer none of them, perfectly understanding engaging with even one would instantly expose the catastrophic flaws in her defense against the others. Realizing total silence remained the absolute only tactic that hadn't yet been demolished by a physical document. Eventually, she weakly argued, the State Investigative Committee was nothing more than a hyper-partisan witch hunt orchestrated by a Republican chairman desperate for cheap political points. Vance instantly countered by bringing up the federal House Oversight Committee, demanding to know if she cooperated with their official requests for documents tying her husband's companies to the mess. She snapped back the House panel, had also been brutally weaponized against Democrats, a defense effectively transforming a second, completely separate demand for evidence into yet another sprawling political conspiracy, leaving the highly sought-after records hidden from public view. Vance then dryly asked if the random local reporter she ignored in the hallway was also a hyper-partisan operative and questioned whether every human being asking about $250 million stolen dollars had somehow magically enlisted in a massive shadow operation dedicated solely to her destruction. Omar remained silent, trapped by the reality that screaming partisanship rapidly loses its effectiveness when forced to apply it to state auditors, federal prosecutors, independent journalists, grand juries, convicted criminals, and senior members of her own party. Vance bluntly stated, the absolute easiest way to clear her name was painfully obvious. Simply release the hidden emails, hand over the requested documents, raise her right hand to testify under oath, and put every supposedly exonerating fact on the table where professional investigators could verify it. Instead of agreeing to transparency, Omar fiercely declared she would never dignify a corrupt system explicitly engineered to criminalize her very existence as a black, Muslim woman serving in Congress, once again swapping the brutal math of missing millions for the emotional shield of intersectional identity. Vance locked onto her exact phrasing and fired back that 65 people were not sitting in prison cells because of her race, religion, personal backstory, or status as a political icon. They were in prison because they systematically looted federal funds, explicitly meant to buy food for starving children. He reminded her those criminals were locked away only after a mountain of hard evidence was presented in a court of law. Not because right-wing pundits complained about their heritage and stressed the luxury mansions and sports cars bought with stolen money didn't magically become less real just because the scammers belonged to a specific minority demographic. The undeniable facts remained: the federal program had been deeply compromised, the government paid out a fortune for meals the DOJ proved were never cooked, and she remained the exact politician whose legislative meddling successfully destroyed the security checkpoints, making this massive grift incredibly difficult to execute. On the Democratic side, a nervous aide slid a folded note toward Senator Richardson, but after a quick glance and a long look at the cornered representative, he placed it face down on the wood, instantly killing whatever rescue mission his team briefly considered. With her back completely against the wall, Omar launched her most aggressive counteroffensive, viciously accusing the administration of intentionally targeting refugees, Muslims, immigrants, and progressive leaders refusing to stay quiet while their communities were under siege. She loudly insisted the grueling hearing had absolutely nothing to do with protecting children and everything to do with destroying a powerful woman whose very presence in the Capitol deeply offended the conservative political machinery Vance represented. Characterizing the DOJ probes, FBI raids, and negative headlines as weaponized tools designed solely to terrify her voters and silence her progressive voice. This specific defense carried immense emotional weight because systemic discrimination and political weaponization are undeniably real issues, and if Vance had simply mocked that reality, it would have handed her the perfect opportunity to claim his cruelty proved her entire point. However, Vance refused to dismiss it, mock it, or pretend identity politics had never been used as a weapon, fully realizing the only way to defeat her narrative was to surgically separate valid concerns about societal prejudice from the undeniable, documented theft of money meant for starving kids. He let her fiery accusations hang in the air before responding, drawing directly from his own personal background rather than stale talking points. Vance spoke about growing up dirt poor in a neighborhood where massive numbers of kids relied heavily on free government lunches, revealing he had been one of those exact children, a kid for whom the cheap food slapped onto a plastic cafeteria tray was often the one and only warm meal he received that entire day. He explained he intimately knew what that federal program looked like when it functioned properly, knew the deep shame and necessity of standing in that lunch line, and understood in his bones why looting a child nutrition fund was infinitely more evil than some dry accounting error between government agencies. The vanished millions weren't just abstract numbers lost in software. They were literal plates of food snatched directly away from vulnerable kids whose desperate parents were already agonizing over whether to pay rent, keep the lights on, or buy groceries. That deeply personal distinction absolutely nuked Omar's desperate attempt to claim total moral ownership over poverty, because Vance wasn't lecturing as a wealthy elite learning about hunger from a briefing folder. He spoke as a man vividly remembering relying on the exact safety net her associates had just finished looting. Pivoting right back to the horrific evidence, he detailed exactly what federal agents discovered when they ripped open the books on claims for over 1 million supposedly fed kids across Minnesota. Law enforcement uncovered completely fabricated phantom distribution sites existing nowhere except on fraudulent applications. Thousands of meals billed to locations permanently shut down for months, and one ridiculous operation boldly claiming to serve 4,000 hot meals a day out of a kitchen roughly the size of a standard bedroom. The taxpayer money supposed to buy milk and bread was instantly laundered elsewhere. Used to purchase a massive 5-bedroom estate in Burnsville, a fleet of luxury vehicles including a Mercedes-Benz and a BMW, a diamond-encrusted Rolex, and massive wire transfers blasted to offshore accounts in Nairobi, Dubai, and Istanbul. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were quietly flying across international borders, while struggling families in Minneapolis were fed absolute lies that a massive food drive was operating exactly as promised, proving vulnerable children were only useful to scammers as names to slap onto fake invoices. Vance listed the extravagant purchases with a chilling lack of theatrical anger, knowing the stark contrast didn't need fake outrage to be effective. High-end sports cars parked in wealthy suburban driveways were literally being paid for by exploiting the hunger of 7-year-old kids. Omar spent the entire afternoon loudly repeating she was a relentless champion for feeding children. But the sprawling criminal empire attached to her legislation had exclusively championed fake invoices, luxury real estate, expensive jewelry, premium cars, and offshore banking. Vance pulled out a quote directly from Omar's own past statements in the Congressional Record, reminding her of the time she fiercely argued the powerful elite must face strict accountability and absolutely nobody should stand above the law. He stared at her and asked if those lofty principles actually applied to her own actions, or if they only applied to political rivals and officials whose downfall happened to be politically convenient for her brand. Omar offered absolutely no response, prompting Vance to bring up the damning 2020 promotional video one last time, reminding the room she personally looked into a camera and promised citizens the Safari restaurant was feeding 2,300 kids a day. That massive figure, proudly wielded as undeniable proof of her immense generosity, now stood directly next to a $16 million criminal fraud conviction. Mountains of federal trial evidence, forged invoices, and a kitchen operation the DOJ proved had only served a tiny, non-existent fraction of the meals billed to the American taxpayer. Vance locked eyes with her across the wooden table and brilliantly distilled the entire sprawling, chaotic hearing down to 4 devastating words that completely stripped away her biography, her procedural complaints, her cries of partisanship, and her empty political rhetoric. Were the children fed? The entire chamber instantly froze. Because that final question wasn't asking if she generally supported kids, if her intentions were pure, if she hated discrimination, or if she felt the investigation was a partisan witch hunt. It surgically asked if the actual, physical meals she promised had ever reached the mouths of the starving children whose suffering had been shamelessly exploited to justify her sloppy legislation, reckless waivers, massive cash payouts, PR stunts, and deliberate destruction of federal oversight. Omar slowly lowered her gaze to the desk, hands resting completely flat on the wood, while her highly paid defense attorney sat frozen beside her, a pen hovering uselessly over a yellow legal pad with absolutely nothing helpful left to write down. 5 agonizing seconds ticked by, slowly stretching into 10, and then 15, with the highly sensitive chamber microphones picking up nothing but the faint rustle of shuffling paper and the quiet intake of a breath that absolutely never materialized into an answer. Vance didn't even bother repeating the question, perfectly content to let the suffocating silence say exactly what every single argument, every single document, and every single criminal conviction had been building toward the entire afternoon.